Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. The U.S. has watered down sanctions on Iran's Revolutionary Guards. Pompeo said countries that deal with the IRGC can continue to do business with U.S. companies and travel into America. To add to this, Iran's foreign minister has made an offer of a prisoner exchange. A British-Iranian woman held in Iran for sedition is to be returned to the UK if an Iranian woman held in Australia, sought by the US for defying its sanctions, is freed. To discuss all of that a bit further, we're joined now by Mr. Farhang Jahanpour, who is a political analyst. He's also a professor and tutor, I should say, at the University of Oxford. He's joining us now from London via Skype. We're also joined by Cyril Widdershoven, who is the director of the Dutch consultancy Verossi. He's joining us now from Netherlands, and he's also a defense analyst. Cyril and Farhang, thank you both for joining us here in Scope. Farhang, I wanted to ask you, what do you make of these exemptions and exceptions that the U.S. has made to these sanctions to the IRGC? It almost seems like this is all just cosmetics, isn't it?
Well, first of all, hello to you and all your viewers and listeners. It has to be stressed before anything else that these sanctions are illegal because the United States reached an agreement with Iran, and it is important to stress it was not just Iran and the United States. It was a negotiation between Iran and 5 permanent members of the Security Council, plus Germany and the United States. And above all, it was endorsed by the EU and also by the Security Council Resolution 2231. So to make unilateral sanctions is illegal, and furthermore, to make extraterritorial sanctions, forcing other countries to abide by your sanctions, are doubly illegal. But it seems that really the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. They keep imposing sanctions in order to just put pressure on Iran, which has gone really beyond any limits of legality and international order or even international relations. We are dealing with zealotry and fanaticism. And of course, one day they say something, then they realize that it is complicated. So they try to do something about it.
Cyril, I wonder what you make of that, because obviously the Americans would themselves, Cyril, and say, listen, when it comes to sanctioning the IRGC, they're concerned about its activities in the region and beyond.
Yes, I do agree slightly with my colleague in Oxford. However, I think that, first of all, any country has a legal right to put sanctions or measures according to their own ideas. In how far these sanctions are effective or are smart to be put in place is another issue. The main reason that the US is putting the sanctions on the IRGC is not largely focused on their role in Iran, but mostly on their role in Syria, Iraq, or with Hezbollah, or slightly maybe inside of Yemen.
And Cyril, if I may come in, do you think that that is a troubling role? Is there a legitimate concern there?
It's geopolitics is always in the eye of the beholder. History is always written by the one that wins. So there are concerns also in the EU, also in the UK, also in major Arab countries about the role that the IRGC is playing in Syria and other areas. And these are legitimate issues. in how far you are able to put sanctions on the IRGC as a terrorist organization. That's another story.
Okay, so if you allow me, I wanted to get a reaction from Farhang. Do you think the IRGC's role in the region is troubling?
Well, first of all, we have got international law to declare an armed forces, part of the regular forces of a country, as a terrorist organization is totally unprecedented and, in fact, nonsensical. You can accuse them of having committed war crimes and you can take them to court. But to call a part of a country's armed forces as a terrorist organization, as I say, is really nonsensical. When Pompeo was discussing the reason for imposing sanctions on IRGC, he really let the cat out of the bag. He said they are a terrorist organization because they support Hezbollah. And what does Hezbollah do? In 2000, it kicked the Israelis out of Lebanon, which they had occupied. So really the main bone of contention is Iran's support for groups which stop further Israeli aggression. Otherwise, Iranian Guard forces, Iran Revolution Guards, have been fighting ISIS, which is a terrorist organization, both in Iraq and in Syria. They were fighting the Al-Qaeda, they were fighting the Taliban. In fact, on many occasions, they were on the side of the United States in fighting the terrorist organizations. So let's be clear in our definition. Of course, America doesn't like Iran's influence in the region, but many countries do not like America's involvement in the region. The fact is that these 150,000 Revolutionary Guards are not a foreign army like the American forces in Iraq or Yemen or the rest of the region. They are the children of the Iranian people. On the one hand, the Trump administration says it has nothing against the Iranian people, but wants to put pressure on the Iranian regime, then comes and calls a major force of 150,000, plus the Basij, which is much more. They have got allegedly connections to 11 million Iranians. To call them terrorists, it is only bound to arouse people's anger and make them turn against the United States. So the move is nonsensical. And I think Iran's retaliation of calling CENTCOM a terrorist organization too is meaningless because a part of a regular army cannot be a terrorist organization. You condemn a country if they do wrong things, they have committed war crimes, you take them to court and you settle it there. To call a part of a country's army terrorist organization is just a sign of desperation, anger, outrage, and zealotry.
Okay, so Cyril, I wanted to, obviously we can debate IRGC for hours, I'm sure, but it seems, Cyril, at the very least that the U.S. has watered all of these anti-IRGC, anti-Iran measures down significantly, hasn't it? Because when Pompeo making that statement saying that these sanctions shall not apply to any ministry, department, agency, division, or other group or subgroup within any foreign government, I mean, or to any business organization. I mean, he's put this so wide-ranging that I wonder, Cyril, if this is just all just for public consumption and to make whoever it is that's meant to be happy, be it the Israelis or otherwise, happy just on the outside as a verbal statement, but not really anything substantial on the ground. This is sort of embarrassing, isn't it, Cyril, for the U.S. to be doing?
It's strange that the advisors which have been pushing for sanctions on the IRGC have not been assessing the issue that when you are sanctioning the IRGC, you directly are getting into an issue that the IRGC is linked to several other non-Iranian groups or non-Iranian countries in which there is a geopolitical or economic interest of the US also. So if you sanction the IRGC in full everywhere, you will have issues in Iraq, in Lebanon, and you put your own allies in the EU or elsewhere under extreme additional pressure because they are also working in Iraq or in Iran or in Lebanon or elsewhere. There should have been an assessment made beforehand, and how it is now being done shows that the left hand is not knowing what the right hand was doing, and it's not a very smart move to need to water it down while you were officially addressing the IRGC in full. Now the only option is that you will restructure your sanctions and say everything that the IRGC is doing in Iran is being sanctioned. And outside of Iran, it's up to the US president to say yes or no. AKA, you can do whatever you want to do.
Okay, let's go into a very short break. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to be back, of course, discussing this issue as well as others as well about that prisoner exchange, which I mentioned in my introduction. Stay with us for that. Viewers, thank you for joining us and staying with us here in Scope as we continue to discuss the sanctions on the IRGC and the U.S. now issuing a number of exemptions, quite wide-ranging exemptions to those sanctions. In this segment, to continue the conversation forth, we're still joined by Professor Farhang Jahanpour, who is a tutor at the University of Oxford. He's joining us now from London via Skype. And we're also joined now by Mr. Kourosh Ziabari, who is a reporter and journalist with the Fair Observer. He's also East-West Center's Senior Journalist Seminar Fellowship alumnus. He's joining us now from Rasht in Iran via Skype. Kourosh, thanks for joining us. And Farhang, thanks for staying with us. Kourosh, let me start with you. What do you make of these exemptions, these quite wide-ranging exemptions that the U.S. has given out when it comes to the sanctions against the IRGC?
So thanks for having me, Waqar. Actually, what I make of the exemptions is that the United States is trying to maintain and bolster its relations with the countries which are basically having relations with IRGC, even though I don't think they will be very much significant given the designation of IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization by the United States government. What's important is that the US government has designated IRGC as a terrorist entity, which will make it difficult for this arm of Iranian armed forces to do business, to conduct its foreign operations. Even though the U.S. exemptions to the sanctions on RGC are important and wide-ranging, as you mentioned, I don't think of significant substance. I think even before the U.S. designation has been under a variety of sanctions and has been targeted with sanctions for several years, and it has been doing business, or its officials were traveling under very difficult circumstances. The United States is trying to simply make it easier for its diplomats or for foreign government officials who have ties with IRGC to travel to the United States. So basically, the designation of IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization, FTO, by the U.S. government was a big shock to Iranian government.
And I wonder, Kourosh, if I may come in for a moment. Farhang, I wanted to get you in on this because, you know, we always talk about how the Iranian government was in shock when this and that sanctions were placed. You know, this sort of, if you know, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, Farhang, goes back to that narrative about that the Iranian government really didn't have any plan B when it came to all of these U.S. actions, even walking away from the nuclear deal, for example. Why do you think there was not better planning, better strategizing on the part of the Iranian government, Farhang?
Well, I think one of the aims of the Trump administration, and especially what Mr. Zarif 2 days ago in New York called the 4B Club, Bolton, Bibi, Netanyahu, Ben Salman, and Ben Zayed, is really to provoke Iran into some hasty action so that then they can use as an excuse for some military operation. And I think Iran is very wise not to fall in that trap. The fact of the matter is that it is quite clear that American administration, sometimes you say we want to impose sanctions to get these results. The results which they want to get seems to be nothing short of a war. You can't declare a branch of an army terrorist organization. You can't impose all-out sanctions. And then as Pompeo declared his 12 points principles that Iran has to abide by, which is really insulting. Since the Second World War, no country has made such outrageous demands from another country which has not been defeated and on the point of surrender. So the outcome is not certain. The outcome seems to be to provoke, and Iran doesn't want to be provoked.
Kourosh, I wonder what you make of that, because we also obviously have still looming over Iranian heads that threat of zeroing Iran's oil exports. Do you think that that will work? Because obviously there are a number of customers of Iranian who buy Iranian oil, I should say, who would be concerned. But at the same time, that sort of pressure also increasing with the Iranians. They're saying that if you continue to block or are successfully able to block our oil exports, we'll block the Strait of Hormuz. Do those sorts of threats work?
Basically, well, I don't think that Iran's oil exports will be brought to zero altogether. But I'm quite confident that Iran will face more difficult times selling its oil, because it's basically an oil-dependent economy. And I'm quite confident that livelihoods for the ordinary Iranian citizens will be complicated. Well, there are a number of Iran's major oil clients that have possibly made it clear to Iranian authorities that they will continue buying Iran's oil, but under very difficult circumstances. Iran might possibly actually sell its oil at lower prices as an incentive to those countries. It's simply an escalation of tensions between Iran and the United States, which is not helpful for the stability and peace in the region, and it's not even helpful for global oil market. I'm sure that, as it has been mentioned earlier in the show, Iran needs to resolution to all of this through possibly offering talks with the United States, because otherwise the escalation of conflicts and tensions between Iran and the United States as two major powers will undermine peace and security in the Middle East. It will even increase the likelihoods of military confrontation between the two countries, even though it's not so far as serious as it seems. But I think there needs to be negotiations between the two countries. We have seen that in 2015, nuclear deal was a successful example of how negotiations and diplomacy can actually settle the differences between two countries. So I think for this matter, actually, there needs to be a solution, because these tensions and actually these conflicts cannot go on for forever. And Iran and the United States, even though they have had very tumultuous relations over the past 4 decades, need to finally settle their differences in a diplomatic and peaceful manner.
Okay, so Farhang, we have this offer, the Iranian foreign minister, and in fact, I'm going to correct the introduction that I made, because in fact, the Iranian foreign ministry has clarified the foreign minister's statement about a prisoner exchange. The Iranian foreign ministry saying that Foreign Minister Zarif meant that only U.S. nationals or a U.S. national in Iranian prison would be exchanged for an Iranian woman who is currently in Australian detention. I believe she's wanted by the U.S. for apparently defying U.S. sanctions in some way. Now, Farhang, I wonder what you make of this offer of a prisoner exchange by the foreign minister of Iran. How significant is that at this time, considering all of the above we've spoken about?
Well, the West, of course, says that the judicial system in Iran is not very impartial and is not acting in a very fair way. Now, I agree with them on that. I think the Iranian judicial system is very harsh and acts in very sort of irregular ways, if I may say so. But also the Iranians believe that a number of Iranians who are imprisoned in the United States on supposedly violating the illegal sanctions and having traded with Iran are also held unjustly. If Mr. Zarif can pull this off, because it's not in his hand, it's the judiciary. But I hope that some agreement can be reached between the judiciary, the government, and the authorities in Iran and the West. I think this Ms. Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe has been wrongly imprisoned. What she is accused of having done certainly does not deserve such long sentences. And there is apparently an Iranian in Australia, which America wants it. And they say that they are prepared to exchange the two together. I think if there is goodwill on both sides, as was under President Obama, many such issues can be resolved peacefully. And if there are prisoners held either in Iran or in America or in the West, which can be exchanged and pardoned, I think it would be a very good step to do that. Because especially I believe that Ms. Zaghari really needs to be released. It is not doing Iran any favors or Iran's image in the world.
Kourosh, what do you make of that offer of an exchange? Zarif, obviously, and the foreign ministry, I should say, clarifying that this is going to be a U.S. national in Iranian prison or in Iranian detention that will be exchanged for this woman, Nigar Ghodskani, I believe is her name, who is currently in Australia.
Yes, I also read the statement by Iran's foreign ministry that there's a possibility of a prisoner exchange. I think it's a pragmatic and realistic decision by Iran to finally come up with this decision. I think that holding these prisoners for long, a very pragmatic and constructive decision for both countries. In Iran's view, actually, those people who have been detained in the United States for violating the sanctions are not guilty. And in the U.S. view, those U.S. nationals who are held in Iran actually are not guilty. So I think a prisoner swap decision is what can lay the groundwork for further decisions countries for settling their other differences. I think it can serve as a good first step. There are a number of other issues between two countries that need to be resolved finally. Including, as in the U.S., Iran support for militant groups in the Middle East and Iran's ballistic missile program, and in Iran's view, the U.S. attempts to topple the government in Tehran. So I think I was personally very surprised by the announcement by Foreign Minister Zarif in New York, who proposed this proposal, and I think it can serve as a very good first step. And after months of actually clashes between the two governments, it was a constructive decision apparently made by the Iranian government, because Zarif is not a very authoritative authority in Iranian government. There are decisions which need to be made by the judiciary, and I think the government has come to this decision to finally come up with a prisoner swap proposal.
All right, Kourosh, we'll leave it as our final word, but of course we appreciate both your times, your insight and analysis. That was Kourosh Ziabari, reporter and journalist with Fair Observer, East-West Center's senior journalist, seminar fellowship alumnus. He was speaking to us from Russia via Skype. We were also joined by Farhang Jahanpour, who is a tutor at the University of Oxford. He was joining us via Skype from London. And earlier we were joined by Dr. Cyril Widdershoven, who is director of Dutch consultancy Verasi. He was joining us from Netherlands. Now, viewers, as all of our guests spoke about, there is the IRGC sanctions, which have been placed by the United States, labeling it a terrorist entity. But at the same time, the U.S. has issued wide-ranging exemptions to that rule, obviously because the IRGC as a military is connected with many countries in the region, and that would make it pretty much impossible for anyone then to deal with the U.S. And or even Iran. And the U.S. saying the business dealings and even travel back and forth to the U.S. would be allowed by those entities that deal with the IRGC, yet the labeling of it as a terrorist entity does remain. What does this mean going forward, considering the oil sanctions, considering the U.S. goal to zero oil sanctions there? And then there is this prisoner exchange that came out of nowhere, really, by the foreign minister of Iran, Mohammad Javad Zarif. Will that actually happen? Does he actually have the power to make that happen? We'll wait and see how all of that works out here in Sculp. I'll be back, though, with our next segment after this break. Thank you for staying with Sculp, viewers. Libya's prime minister has denounced France for supporting General Haftar, who is attempting to take the Libyan capital. Last week, armed French diplomats were caught by Tunisia while crossing from Libya. It is alleged that they provided logistical support to Haftar. Italy says France is supporting Haftar to ensure benefits for its oil company. The uncertainty about who really rules Libya lingers on. To discuss all of this a bit further, we're joined now by Mr. Ian Ferguson, who is a journalist and documentary filmmaker. He's joining us now from Essex in the UK. We're also joined by Mr. Matteo Capasso, who is a research associate at the European University Institute and associate editor of Middle East Critique. He's joining us now from Florence in Italy. And we're also joined by Younis Lahwej, who is a lecturer in politics and international relations of the Middle East. He's at the University of Reading, in the UK, and he's joining us now from Readings in the United Kingdom. Younis, Matteo, and Ian, thank you all for joining us. Younis, if I may, I'd like to start with you. What do you make of the Libyan Prime Minister and his denunciation, essentially, of France for supporting who he called dictator Haftar?
Yes, actually, thank you for having me. And Libya is a very complicated, situation right now, and even after 2011. This is not new, actually, because the country is divided between, and many fronts, either locally or regionally or internationally. So they have many layers to understand the situation. So it's not surprising to have the Prime Minister saying that. And Haftar is when you're looking at, is the country is divided between East and West, or there's a government already in the Tripoli capital, in the capital of the country, Tripoli, and there's another government in the eastern part where Haftar is really based and leading this military operation against the other government. So the connection with the French and other actors. So this is when we talk about international actors. Yeah. We have, the French in one side, the Italian on the other side, we have the British, the American, and so on. And this is connected with the regional powers as well, which is we're talking about Qatar, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Egypt. So it's quite understandable, this sort of division going on in the country, and actually reflected on the international and regional actors as well.
Matteo, what do you think the game plan of the French is here? Why would they support Haftar over a government which even most European countries, if I'm not mistaken, support?
Yeah, I mean, it is quite sad to see these developments happening in Libya, because we shouldn't be forgetting that France at the same time is a permanent member of the United Nations. So you get a UN recognized government in the west of the country, and then at the same time one of the countries sitting inside was created an international institution like the United Nations is supporting another government. So you see, on an international level, you see definitely the completely dysfunctional role of the United Nations in dealing with such situation. And I'm talking about not just about Libya here. You can think about Palestine. You can think about Yemen. It's just one more proof of the situation. Regarding the game plan of France, I would say that definitely there are interests, big economic interest in the country. This date back to Sarkozy as well, and to the whole to the whole, military intervention that was used to topple Gaddafi in 2011. France is trying to get a upper hand in Libya, certainly. What probably, we should try to see this happening also in a wider context, which is the fact that the biggest oil resources coming to Europe, and I'm referring to Iran and Russia, are currently under sanction. So, what does this tell us? It tells us that basically Europe is fighting over one of the cheapest and, easiest resources of oil to get, which is Libya. And so, this is unfolding right away in their neighborhood in North Africa. And all this situation has been created by the US at the same time. So, really, to me, it seems to me that we're seeing a larger infighting also among the Western Bloc.
Ian, what do you make of that? It is a bit confusing, isn't it, that France is standing, in an opposite stance when it comes to the European governments vis-a-vis their support for the UN-backed government in Tripoli. France, obviously publicly saying it supports the UN-backed government, but behind the scenes, with what's happened in Tunisia at the border, with the capture of those 13-odd armed French diplomats there, who were apparently providing logistical support to Haftar. What do you make of all that?
Well, I'm always pretty skeptical when I hear about people giving logistical support. I saw this in South America, in El Salvador, and in many other countries. But I agree with your other two contributors. Firstly, I think it's a disaster for the Libyan people. Post 9/11, we had a situation there where Britain and France were at the forefront of making sure that Gaddafi was deposed, and left us with a situation where people retrenched into tribal politics. Now we have a reasonably stable government, and I think the Prime Minister, when his denunciation of France, he's correct. But France has a history of intervening in Libya. As an example, a leading lawyer in Tripoli, whose office was ransacked and his files were taken away in the post-Gaddafi area, or at the time, was thought to be perhaps Gaddafi's lawyer. He wasn't, in fact, Gaddafi's lawyer, but his office was raided by the Action Direct of the French Foreign Intelligence Service and all his files taken away, probably to see if there was any link to the Sarkozy Libyan money, which all my sources in Libya showed me was paid to Sarkozy. But for the Macron to now say that he's helping stabilize Libya is just nonsense. Even with the purchase of vessels that will effectively be controlled by the Libyan Coast Guard in an effort, I think nothing that Macron's doing is stabilizing the situation in Libya. And in fact, it goes beyond that. I think sometimes when we have administrations who have got domestic problems, as Macron does have at home, when their popularity starts to wane at home, they stride onto the international stage. And I think there's another dimension here. Although France and Britain were involved in the deposing of Gaddafi, Britain is now so embroiled in the whole Brexit fiasco that France is taking a march here and thinking, we can stride the international stage here. And as Matteo said, Libyan oil is very easy, it's light, it's easy to refine, it's cost effective. So I think there's a mix, commercial interests and political aspirations which I think some leaders have in Western Europe, of going back to empire.
Okay, so Younis, your thoughts about the commercial interest here, A, but then B, I wanted to add this on because, Europe has been so concerned for a number of years now, Younis, about the asylum seeker flow. And we know a lot of those asylum seekers do sometimes come through Libya. I'm a bit confused about why France would then still be supporting Haftar, because all of that creates instability in Libya. And I imagine that just, increases the possibilities of ever more asylum seekers trying to cross the oceans into Europe. Why would France be doing that, creating an even more unstable situation where even more refugees seek asylum in Europe?
I think the discussion is taking one side, to be honest. I mean, we are talking about only France and only France as if it's created the problem. And the French, their intervention is not today, actually. The problem is the NATO intervention in 2011. That's what created the whole mess you see today. I mean, before 2011, we have stable government, we have stable regime, and it's prevented this sort of flow of illegal immigrants to Europe and to France and to the Mediterranean region. But actually, since the destruction of the army and the military and the security services and actually stabilization, the pillars of the state, it's become a failing state. Whether, if we look at it from the other side, I'm not defending actually Haftar or other groups, but actually there's the Italian actually supporting the main government supposed to be appointed by the United Nations. Britain as well is supporting another political element, which is basically the Muslim Brotherhood and other radical Islamists, which is British suffering from them for some time, which they used to harbor for many years, and now they are running the scene in Tripoli. So actually, it's not as well when we're looking at only oil. Yes, oil is one of the factors, and we have fighting ISIS in the desert of Libya. We have, the flow of immigration. We have the strategic location. All of these actors, and of course, Gaddafi was the problem with the West. This is actually settling the issue with Gaddafi, and this is ongoing since 2011 and the European intervention of the in Iraq, and making it, or the result is another failing state in the Middle East. So it's actually a constant sort of policy. It's implemented by the Western government for some time. So this is when we look at Libya, you should look at actually the whole thing together. I mean, it's not just one piece and leave to the other piece. So, and my understanding is that is Haftar. When we talk about Haftar, actually we shouldn't really personalize the situation. It's mainly we're talking probably the Libyan army and what the Libyan army tried to achieve, and who's actually working with Haftar or actually supporting Haftar right now, and who's supporting the other militias in Tripoli. So we have, as I said, we have a divided society. We have a divided, I wouldn't say political elites, because unfortunately all the game is about money, and that's even the Salam himself actually pointed that for how the Libyans' corruption and for 8 years or 9 years so far, no one could really do anything for the Libyan people. We are talking. We shouldn't really just talking about the immigration. It's important for Europe, but actually, what's about the daily life of the people who's living in Tripoli and other areas? So they are suffering, and they don't have even the basic needs. They don't have any security. They barely get their money, their salaries out of the banks, and so on. So the situation is very complicated. Of course, the Western intervention is actually made the whole mess today.
Matteo, this goes back to something which I wanted to bring up, and I think I brought this up in a conversation that we had in an earlier show with you, about this issue of strong men in the region, across the Middle East and even North Africa. If we look right now at the example of Egypt, for example, Sisi now, essentially can be in power till 2030 if he so wishes. Do you think that sometimes the lesson for the people on the ground is that a strong man who brings stability is better than instability brought in by a democratic government?
I think that, that's a good question indeed, Waqar. To think about it in the sense that we need to define exactly what do we mean by strong man here. The notion has been used and linked up to the dictatorship or authoritarian government. If we go back to Gaddafi's time, he was a strong man as well, and now after he's a strong man, Sisi is a strong man. Precisely, the way it's used, particularly in the Western discourse, the notion of the strong man is like the discourse on modernization. It can easily become, just an umbrella term to basically label derogatorily a certain government. What we could say is that, and I link here to what Dr. Younis was mentioning, is that the country is in total collapse. It's not becoming, is in chaos. It's a complete fragile state. What do we have with Haftar, and this is why I think it does have somehow some sort of support, is that it's been able to put back together an institution in Libya, which is the army, although we do need to recognize that there is not a uniform, coalition or groups. I mean, there are so many that they did fought with the militias of the Khamis Brigade, for example, which was part of the Gaddafi army. So, I mean, it is very varied, the support that Haftar has. What would be interesting to see is that is Haftar now going into Tripoli, not just because of the support of regional and Western powers, but also because he requires the money to keep buying off those who are actually fighting for him. So the fight is basically turning into a fight over the banks and the money that Libya has, and we know exactly that this is controlled by the Western government.
Yeah. Okay, so Ian, I wonder what you make the criticism of the Western intervention, A, that brought down Gaddafi, and B, then going forward, then what does this mean about a strongman? Do we need a strongman at the helm in Libya?
Waqar, I would think we don't need a strong man. The world is full of strong men at the moment. As Matteo said, we have Sisi, who took off an army uniform, put a suit on, and now could be president in Egypt, for the next 12 years, ostensibly. We have too many strong men. What we need are cool heads. And despite the fact we never seem to, in the West, I think, generally speaking, ever look at the consequences of our actions. I've spent years in Libya. Now, is it a regime that I wanted to live under? No. Was Gaddafi a strong man? Yes. But the country was relatively stable pre-9/11, relatively stable and moving forward. But memories in the West of America and other people wanting to pay him back for alleged crimes and actual crimes brought about where we are today. But I hear from Libyan people almost on a daily basis of life there. It's shocking. There was always pride in the tribe that you came from, your family, Gaddafi from one tribe, Haftar from another. These people were proud of their heritage. Yeah. But after post the 2011, they regrouped into tribes, and now they're all fighting. And even in the beaches surrounding Tripoli, there are various sectors of the beach controlled by various militia groups. I mean, it's a disaster zone now. It's shocking, and it makes me really sad because I've watched Libya from the early 70s when I visited right through to just a few years ago, deteriorate dreadfully in the last few years. And I really do hope that people will stop looking at Haftar, who was, courted by the CIA and the DIA for years in efforts to strategically topple Gaddafi, is going to come in as the savior now. And I don't buy this savior thing. I think the EU, if they want to have a unified policy, they should stick and put Macron in his place and say, look, we're speaking with a united European front. Instead of now we've got clashes between Italy and France. Yeah. As I said, Britain is now staying out of it in a way because they're too self-obsessed with what's happening in the Conservative Party to worry about what's happening elsewhere. But it's so sad for that area, so close to Europe. We should be friends. We should be helping stabilize, not destabilize.
Okay, so Younis, then how does one size a situation that is, as you had put it, Younis, a complex one in Libya? Do we want Haftar to come in and take the helm at least for a little while so that the situation stabilizes? Or do we continue supporting, as an international community, I'm speaking, as Europe, as whoever we want to label it as, the UN-backed government in Tripoli? What is a smart move at this time vis-a-vis stabilization?
Right. First of all, I think the notion or the issue or the concept of the strong man, I think we need a strong nation, a strong country before we talk about the person who's going to take over. I mean, as I said earlier, the country is very divided internally and domestically, and even on the family basis, going from bottom up. So that's the first one. And we need really strong institutions rather than, we talk about personality and person. The stabilization, first of all, you need to have, I think we have to go from the the roots of the problem, the NATO intervention and the United Nations role. I think the United Nations role so far is not effective. It's really remind me of the 1950s when the Libyan, tried to gain independence, and always the United Nations said, bringing reports, they are not ready, they're not ready. And it seems we are repeating ourselves. So there is a weak United Nations role in the Libyan situation. Yeah. The international community is very divided, between different blocks of states or group of states against others, reflecting actually its national interest, which is quite normal. And this is again happens in 1950s again in the same way. When I bring the history back, I find the history repeating in itself. So the stabilization needs really to first of all to get rid of these militias, either by peaceful means or by military means. I think the military means shouldn't. I wouldn't really put it at the first option, but actually failing to abide by many sort of meetings and results and trying to bring this militia into the line of government and to be part of the whole process, which is failing, of course. And that's why probably now we see the military option is in the table, which is, I don't think so, is going to settle the situation unless you're going to destroy Tripoli as it happens in Benghazi and Derna, which is, I hope this scenario wouldn't happen. So we need really international, we need really the regional actors, which is today actually still feeding in by providing military assistance and military equipment and hardware from these two, specifically the regional actors. We're talking about Turkey, Qatar on one side, and the United Arab Emirates and Saudis, and the Egyptians on the other side. So we need really to have sort of consensus, or at least the international community send a very strong signal to these small states, or actually the regional states, not to intervene in the situation in Libya. So we need really to work from outside before we go internally. Because internally, I think it's not that difficult to tackle once the international community started to figure themselves out and put their priorities right and start really to move forward.
Very well. We'll leave there as our final. Of course, we appreciate all of your time, your insight and analysis. That was Dr. Younis Lahwej, a lecturer in politics and international relations at the Middle East at the University of Reading in the UK. We were also joined by Matteo Capasso, who is a research associate at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, and is associate editor of Middle East Critique. And we were also joined finally by Mr. Ian Ferguson, who is a journalist and documentary filmmaker. He had been speaking to us from the UK as well. Now, viewers, as all of our guests spoke about, certainly the situation on the ground in Libya is a complex one. There are divisions within the country ever since the fall of Gaddafi, the NATO intervention, as Younis there had mentioned, and others had mentioned. The narrative sometimes is that we need a strong man at the helm, as I'd brought up, but will that really help stabilize the country? What does this mean for Europe and French and Italian and other commercial interests in the country because of Libyan oil? As Matteo had contextualized, now we see Iran and Russia sanctions, so many would look to a country like Libya for their oil supplies. And that, of course, possibly quite a large factor in their interests within Libya. But of course, we'll wait and see how all of this develops, and if Haftar does march on Tripoli itself, what happens next. That's all for this edition of Scope, though. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.